Welcome to the NBR Podcast Summer Series. In fact, this is our last episode before we crack back into regular programming. And what a way to finish with our political editor, Brent Edwards, who has put down his longboard, wiped the zinc from his nose and taken off his bucket hat to come in and reflect on the past year in politics. Brent, welcome. Thanks for coming on. This is the way
I didn't have a choice.
Let's just gloss over that part, okay? All right. Well, normally, Brent, we start with the biggest story, but I just want to, in this year of politics, is there one particular story that you can point to?
Look, I don't think there's a single story that would stand out, but I think there are stories that sit within a theme that stand out. And I think, obviously, the economy, it's dominated the year, and in terms of the political arguments, the government's response to that and the impact then it has on its fiscal position. And we saw right at the end of the year with the half-year update and the budget policy statement, you know, the Treasury winding back their forecast, things more dismal than they thought on both the economy and also on the government's books, meaning it won't get into surplus until later than forecast, those kind of things. So that's been a big part of it. But I think then the other issue would be the Treaty Principles Bill, but Maori issues more generally, and which obviously culminated in that hikoi to Parliament where, tens of thousands, I mean at least 50,000, I've never seen a hikoi, a protest at Parliament as big as that, and that was pretty extraordinary. But that was an issue though that dominated through the year as well, discussions around the place of the treaty. So no single story, although it did, as I say, culminate in that hikoi to Parliament.
One of the things I wanted to pick up with you about the economy is that when the coalition government came in, there was this sort of idea that they would make things better. By the end of the year, though, it's not. So how politically have they managed that?
Well, politically, they've managed it by blaming the last lot. It's all Labor's fault that the economy at the end of the year and that the books at the end of the year were worse than at the beginning of the year and worse than forecast. So, you had a finance minister, Nicola Willis, taking no responsibility at all for the state of the books. When some people, though, do point to the fact that, tax cuts that they implemented through the year and the bringing back the tax deductibility for landlords and what have you, costs more than $16 billion over the 4-year forecast period. So clearly that's had a bit of a negative impact on the state of the books. And the New Zealand First Leader and Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters has been quick to point out that he warned before the election, and he did. He said then that the economy was in much worse shape than people thought and that National would be silly to go ahead with tax cuts. They themselves too were saying what a poor state the economy was in before the election, but still went ahead with tax cuts. Yeah. They've continued to say how challenging it is, but then everyone seems to throw their hands up in surprise when they get the forecast and say, oh no, it's worse than we thought. Oh, it must be the other lot's fault. Look, to be fair, no government can take responsibility for a single year of accounts. There are years of work to build into that, so previous governments take a share of the blame. But the government of the day does have to shoulder most responsibility for the numbers they produce.
Yep. All right. So we do talk about the biggest winner in your view. I mean, you've mentioned the response to the hikoi. That could be one candidate. Are there any other? The response to the Treaties Bill and that hikoi that you said you'd never seen anything like that. But are there any other candidates in your view? Yeah,
look, I might kind of, take there's no single winner.
Yeah.
So, probably if you take the governing parties, New Zealand First, ACT and National, they can all pat themselves on the back that they've had a year in government and the government has stayed pretty strong and solid. There have been accusations that they're falling apart, but in fact, no, they end the year in pretty solid state. David Seymour makes the point, the ACT party leader, it's a massive success for ACT just being there, being in government. First involvement in a coalition. They've always been ministers outside of CAT. So that's a massive achievement for ACT, particularly if you go back just a couple of elections where you might have thought ACT was finished as a political force.
Right.
But they've come back. So again, for New Zealand First, having been turfed out of Parliament, coming back into government, and both parties having quite an influence on the direction of the government.
And also, also two deputy prime ministers as well. I mean, they're both up there in terms of the levels of involvement.
Yeah, well, OK, we'll say that Winston Peters is the winner this year because he's Deputy Prime Minister. When we talk at the end of next year, it'll be David Seymour because he'll be Deputy Prime Minister.
OK, all right. Has there been a biggest sort of blunder or a biggest loser from the last year politically?
Well, you'd have to think the biggest loser must be Darlene Tana, the ex-Green MP, ex-MP now, who came into Parliament, then got embroiled in the controversy over allegations about her husband's business or that she was involved in terms of exploiting migrant workers. She didn't respond to questions from the Green Party. A report was done that, implicated her in that. She kept on backing off, trying to delay, and she did delay it until well into, October, but finally was forced out under the waka jumping legislation, which was legislation the Green Party had opposed on principle, but they used in this case. But they went through and I guess if you talk about the Green Party, if you talk about the party that's had the toughest time has to be the Greens.
Absolutely, I was going to mention that.
Horror year for them.
Yeah, so many people. So let's just quickly run through that. I mean, so apart from Darlene Tana and that controversy, we've had Efeso Collins pass away, is that right? And who else? Who are the other personnel that have been affected in the Greens this year?
Well, if you go back to the very beginning of the year, early January, Golriz Ghahraman resigned as an MP, following on from the allegations, and she went through court in the end of shoplifting.
That's right.
So you then had the incident with Julianne Genter in Parliament, where she stood over Minister Matt Ducey and was censored. Clearly another, terrible piece of news with Marama Davidson being diagnosed with breast cancer and being away for the latter half of the year getting treatment, and we hope that's going really well. So of course they had James Shaw, stand down as co-leader and then retire from politics. So they lost someone with a lot of experience and stature, and being a particularly, I guess, baptism by fire for Chloe Swarbrick, who replaced him as co-leader, and almost immediately had Marama Davidson having to take leave. So Chloe Swarbrick has shouldered much of the burden of these issues.
How has she done, do you think?
Well, look, I think she's done pretty well. And again, just as ACT, would say that their success is being here. I mean, the Green Party is still standing.
Yep.
They're still there. They do look actually pretty cohesive now. I think talking to a number of the MPs, they kind of say that all of those problems have made them more resilient. So the Green Party, I guess, ends the year having had a terrible year, but probably in a stronger position in a way because of it.
Interesting too. I wonder about Te Pāti Māori, whether they've had a good year because of the Treaty Principles Bill.
Well, they have had a good year. I mean, they've obviously had a good election result. They've got a number of MPs, and they've obviously made a real point in Parliament and a presence there. And the Treaty Principles Bill, you might say, they wouldn't like to think this, I don't think, because they'd rather it wasn't there.
Yeah.
But they have been, really, really arguing the case against the Treaty Principles Bill, but also arguing the case against much of what the government was doing before the bill was introduced in terms of how they see it relegating Māori and basically putting Māori down as second-class citizens almost, that they thought there was a kind of a partnership developing, if you like, which, obviously the ACT Party disagrees with.
Yep.
And that's been, in their eyes, sort of destroyed by the actions of this coalition government. And so they have been very, very strident and outspoken in opposing what the government has been doing.
And in a sort of contrary kind of way, that sort of like consolidates their position, I guess, for what they're trying to achieve. It consolidates their representation.
Certainly consolidates their position and representation. They're there as Te Pāti Māori representing that viewpoint. But they're also quite careful to talk about, they see it as uniting the whole country. So, people will argue about division or what's dividing. But when you talk to Te Pāti Māori MPs, they do talk about uniting the country.
Right.
While they have a strong Māori viewpoint, they see it as being uniting the whole country together and taking a more collective view if you like, towards politics, I guess, which stands in contrast to the ACT Party, which, as a Libertarian Party, I guess, has much more of a focus on individual rights and the individual.
Okay, just moving on then. I mean, are there any other sort of notable mentions that we haven't highlighted that you've come across this year?
Well, notable mentions. I mean, I don't know about a notable mention, but I mean, we haven't talked about the Labor Party.
Oh, well, there you go.
The sort of, the major opposition party.
Yeah.
I mean, the Labor Party's come in for criticism, and the Labor Party leader Chris Hipkins has been called invisible or what have you. But actually, I guess from Labor's perspective, you look at the polling. It's been polling not highly, but it's been polling more highly than the vote it got in the 2023 election. It's been pretty disciplined, pretty focused. They've still got a lot of work to do on policy, but they seem to have agreed on a process to develop or otherwise a tax policy, capital gains tax policy, or maybe a wealth tax policy. And that's actually also caused, some excitement within Te Pāti Māori and within the Green Party, who both have wealth taxes and want to see a change in the tax system. So they see Labor looking at that now, and that maybe that offers an opportunity, I guess, on maybe the centre-left of politics, that a future centre-left government therefore might make the sorts of tax changes they think are necessary. So Labor would pay, they haven't had what you'd call a standout year, but from a year after having lost an election quite badly, I think they would see it as a pretty solid year for them.
And what about, just quickly, what about Chris Hipkins? I mean, after having lost so badly, there was that expectation that he would not stick around, but he has. And how has he performed? Yeah,
well, there was some expectation from some. I mean, I never thought he himself was going to just walk away. I mean, he'd only been leader since February of 2023.
Seems so long ago.
And stepped straight into the job of Prime Minister. And people forget that while there's criticism of Hipkins' leadership, people forget that when he became leader and Prime Minister, Labor went up in the polls. And for a brief period, Labor was ahead of National. And in that early in 2023, in fact, you looked at the results and it was still very, very possible that you would have had a Labor-led government re-elected. Its support then started to just drift away. But I think you can put a lot of that down to, obviously on people's ongoing worries about the economy and a bit of angst about that long lockdown in Auckland sort of, meaning that Aucklanders were a bit sort of sceptic about Labor. But also when you talk about a lot happened, remember how many ministers fell over in that last year of the Labor government. That did not help them at all. It certainly didn't help Chris Hipkins.
Yeah, so Brent, we all know you've been around for a while, so you're used to looking forward. We've hit 2025. What are you expecting?
That was a really polite way of saying I'm old, so thank you for that. But in 2025, obviously, in the early part of the year, we'll still have the Treaty Principles Bill as a key issue as it goes through the Select Committee. And I guess from the government's perspective and Prime Minister Christopher Luxon's perspective, he'll want to get that out of the way pretty soon and then move on. But again, I think, it's going to be the economy. So Christopher Luxon says 2025 is about a year of growth, so there'll be a real interest then in saying, well, what is it the government is doing practically to help the economy grow quicker and to get more people into jobs and stuff. But you won't see a lot of impact of that in 2025. The economy is forecast to grow through the year, but unemployment will still go up because unemployment lags growth. So you won't, if the forecasts are right, we won't start to see unemployment falling until 2026.
Right.
So it's still going to be a difficult year. And that will, I think, dominate a lot of the political debate will be around the economy, how the government finance is going, who's responsible, is this government doing enough to get the economy going? And while it continues and it seems to foreshadow more spending cuts, are those cuts then biting into frontline services when it says it won't touch frontline services? So there'll be a lot of debate around that, I think.
Okay, we will look forward to it. Brent Edwards, thank you so much for coming on to the Summer Series podcast, And that wraps up the entire summer series on the NBR podcast. Thanks to our production team and our journos for making it happen. We are back with our regular content featuring top business leaders and hot button issues. And first up will be a CEO who's turned around a company so successfully, he's decided to leave. I'm Simon Shepherd. We'll catch you then.